1, 2. from afar, both of you, but not ever within reaching distance. Yeah, are you here for the whole? Are you here for the whole session? Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Catch up. Okay, morning everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes, brilliant. So we'll get going. We're running a little bit behind and we've got lots to pack in today, so we'll get started. But firstly, welcome. Thank you all for making the journey, even though it's really hot and the trains were really not very good, apparently, today. So I'm glad you all made it here. There's lots of you here for the first time. I think we've got the biggest number of first-time attendees that we've had. So I think about 25 people here for the first time. So thank you for joining us, and you're very welcome, and we hope you'll feel comfortable today and take away some good information. But the key thing about a support group, as you might guess, is that you get to meet each other, share your stories, share your experiences, and so there'll be plenty of time for that during lunch and in the small group discussions after lunch. And I've already heard some really good conversations happening this morning, so I hope you've all had a chance to say hello to someone. Also, just to mention, there's a room at the back of the conference suite which we have reserved as sort of a breakout area. So if at any point you're having a bit of information overload, you want to take some time out, or you're not particularly interested in a part of the day, feel free to go and just have a sit in there with a coffee, and if you'd like to, that room is there. So we'll just go through some notices. First of all, I'll try and whiz through these. The meeting is being live streamed, so hello to anyone who's watching at home. And so that does mean that anything you say in the questions will be live and available online for people to see, so just bear that in mind if you have any questions with any personal information or anything. The toilets, hopefully you've all found them. They're at the back there, the ladies first and then the gents just behind those. We're not expecting any fire drills today, so if there is one, we do need to go, and you can follow those of us who know where we're going and the green exit signs. And the assembly point is in the UCL main quad, but we can help you to get there. Hopefully we won't need to. So some notices, just to introduce the team. Everyone who's here from the team, could you just stand up and do a big wave? So if you have any questions during the course of the day, if you want to know where anything is, how anything's working, those are your people to talk to. And if Claire and Siobhan, you could give another wave. They have just joined our team. They'll be helping out with the Rare Dementia Support Impact Study and with meetings, so you'll be seeing a lot of them both. Please do say hello today. You can all sit down now, thank you. Just in terms of practicalities, you'll know we trialled Eventbrite for the first time for registrations this time. Thank you for your patience with that. It worked really well from our end. Let us know if you have any issues with it, or if you're not sure if your registration's gone through or whatever, do let us know. We're still in the early days of it, but thank you for your cooperation with that. Another practicality, Welcome have very generously offered us this space to host these meetings for another year, which we're all delighted about, and we hope you will be too, so we'll see you many more times here. You will have heard, some of you before, that UCL Access to Justice are running a legal advice service, which is a pilot for this support group and another. And we have some forms available. If you have any kind of legal queries that you would like some advice with, they're offering a one-off free consultation to people. So do give any of us a shout if you have any burning issues, and we can direct you to those forms. There'll be some researchers here to talk over lunch if anyone is interested in getting involved in research or wants to know more about a particular project. Just to give you a rundown, there's a music study, our rare dementia support impact study, which is evaluating these groups, an MRI study, and someone developing a public transport, an application for helping people to use public transport. So if you have anything to add to that conversation, please do find people over lunch. And I now just wanted to hand over to Eva, who's going to explain a little bit about how Rare Dementia Support is funded and how you can get involved in fundraising.
Hello, my name is Eva and I work for the National Brain Appeal. The National Brain Appeal set up the Fund for Rare Dementia Support 3 years ago, which was a combination of two funds, which was the FDT Support Group and the Myrtle Ellis Fund. We have pledged to raise 150,000 over the past 3 years. This year we're increasing our funding to 250, and hopefully by 2022 that will rise again to 350, in the hope that we can expand the service in 3 different areas: education, support and research, and the legal service is also part of that as well. We have a fantastic network of fundraisers, and they take part in all sorts of things, from online quizzes to, I think in a week's time we have a gentleman crossing the Mongolian steppe in a 20-year-old VW with a rocking horse on top. So we really wish him good luck. So a complete range of activities that people take part in. But also I think what's important for everybody here to know is that we are hoping to expand this service, obviously, in the hope that we will be able to set up a new centre for rare dementia support in a few years' time. There will be more information on that a little bit later in the year. If anyone would like any information about fundraising, or has any ideas, or has people that they would like to introduce to me, I'm very, very happy to talk to them. I'm here at the break and at lunchtime, and I'd love to meet anybody that has any questions or has any queries at all. We are very committed to helping to support this community in all the ways that we can. So I look forward to meeting people. Thanks very much.
Okay, so we have 2 talks this morning, and then we'll break for lunch. And then after lunch, we'll have some small group discussions, but we'll remind you after lunch where those are, what those are. So don't worry about those for now. I'm just going to hand over to Seb to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Emma, and I'd just like to add my warm welcome to you all. My name's Seb Crutch. There are lots of familiar faces here and lots of people I've not met before, so I look forward to chatting with you over lunch. So we're delighted that this morning Samrah Ahmed is going to come and talk to us about some of her own work with people living with PCA and their family members in Oxford. And I thought, just as a little bit of context, for those of you particularly who are here for the first time, we know that PCA, posterior cortical atrophy, is this, and is typically described as this progressive disorder and change in visual functions. That's what's usually emphasised, this difficulty, progressive difficulty in seeing what and where things are because of the brain's difficulty in interpreting the information that's coming in about the visual world around us. And I think it's right that we talk about PCA as the sort of the classical visual dementia or degenerative syndrome. But of course, as many people here will know from their own experience, and as we've often talked about in other meetings, there are many, many symptoms and challenges that people face in addition to those visual elements of the condition. We've talked often about the challenges that word finding can pose, how finding the right label for things or the sound of a word can be tricky. And we've certainly had lots of meetings where we've discussed the sort of weird and wonderful, or not so wonderful as the case may be, extra symptoms, sensory symptoms, strange feelings, things that just don't seem quite right but are difficult to put into words. Challenges with balance being one good example. But what we don't often talk so much about is memory. And partly that's because in the textbooks, that's often how clinicians distinguish PCA from so-called typical Alzheimer's disease or other degenerative conditions. We talk about this balance that people with PCA have challenges with their vision, seeing what and where things are, but memory for day-to-day events tends to be relatively better compared to our sort of stereotypical picture of someone with Alzheimer's disease who the presenting symptoms may really be with remembering events, encoding new information, recalling appointments, where they've put things, those sorts of issues. But we know, of course, it's not a clear-cut distinction. PCA and typical Alzheimer's disease aren't in two totally separate boxes. There's lots of overlap, and there's certainly lots of people who will have challenges with vision, but also challenges with memory and language and other skills. And so we thought it'd be really good to hear from Samrah today, who's particularly taken an interest in characterising and describing these memory challenges in the people that she knows with PCA. And that's what we have the great pleasure in hearing about now. There'll be, as usual, a short talk and then lots of opportunity for questions and answers. So do feel primed. If there are things generally about PCA and memory or specific questions about Samrah's presentation, please do feel free to save those up for a few minutes' time. All right, Samrah.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Seb, and thank you very much for inviting me here this morning. I'm very pleased to see a few familiar faces here who were interrogated, possibly traumatized in the making of some of this research. So thank you very much. So what I wanted to share with you, is there a pointer? Is it this one? Is that a pointer? Just make sure I've got it right. Okay. So a couple of projects that I wanted to speak with you about today. So the first one, as Sab said, is looking at how memory changes in PCA. So we became interested in this because we would ask the patients that would come into our clinic in Oxford about the changes they were experiencing, and they were indeed these visual processing skills, changes in spatial awareness, the things that characterize PCA. But then when we asked, are there any other symptoms that are troubling you, we would often hear that memory was a very common complaint. And so we thought, well, let's have a look into this a little bit more. What is the nature of the complaints that are being made here? So the first thing that we did was to ask our PCA research group and their families about the sorts of things that they were noticing about their memory in everyday life. And people said to us, well, we noticed things like we lose things around the house, frequently struggling with names of people, with the name of objects, struggling with poor concentration, not being able to concentrate on a task, and sometimes becoming confused in particularly unusual surroundings. So what's particularly interesting, I think, here, two key things to note are that, first of all, these complaints seem to be frequent. So they were experienced at least 2 to 3 times in a week, and for some people on a daily basis. So these numbers are the percentage of our research group who were experiencing the complaints. So if you take something like forgetting the name of somebody that they know. This is something that almost 3/4 of our group were saying that, yeah, this is something frequently that we observe, a few times each week. Some people were, a small percentage, about 12%, saying, well, actually on a daily basis, this is something that I'm finding difficult. But another thing that's important to note is that actually some people aren't finding this to be a problem at all, and this was true for all of these different memory symptoms, that actually a small percentage and sometimes a larger percentage don't seem to have any changes in their memory as such. The second thing to note here is that this questionnaire was given to people when we first met them in the clinic, so the first time that they're receiving a diagnosis of PCA. So it's quite early on that these sorts of changes are being experienced alongside the typical visual changes. So the next thing we did was to have a look at how our group was managing on more objective tests. So we gave them the Addenbrooke's cognitive examination. I'm sure lots of you have been subjected to this. So in terms of memory, what we ask people to do is to remember a few words and to remember a name and address. So to learn these, and then we'll ask about them after a short delay. So in a group of people on your left here who don't have PCA, otherwise healthy, they tend to score quite highly on this sort of test. So they're in and around the top score of 26. They're able to recall much of what was learned. With our PCA group, we found that there were a group of people who were able to manage that sort of memory test quite easily, scoring within that kind of healthy range. There are some people who are scoring more in a sort of a mid-range, and then there are others who are finding it tough to remember those words and that name and address. The other important thing to note here is that is again, there's nobody scoring right at the bottom there, nobody at 0. So it's not that memory is so poor that people are finding this to be a significant complaint. It's still the visual problems that are taking precedent. Okay, so the next logical question was, well, why is this occurring? Why are our PCA research group having these memory problems? Why are they complaining about these sorts of symptoms? And it's an interesting question, because lots of research, including the research that's been done here by Seb and others at UCL, shows that those parts of the brain that look after our memory centres, they aren't typically affected early in PCA, and indeed for many years into the condition. But what we do know is that memory it changes, it's affected for lots of different reasons. We can fail on a memory test for lots of reasons. And one in particular is that sometimes an apparent memory problem is actually related to attention. So if we don't give full attention, if we don't explicitly concentrate on an item of information that needs to be learnt, then it's often the case that we haven't learnt it well enough in order to be able to recall it later on. So we looked at this question: is it possible that attention is the culprit here? And that's the reason for why our PCA group are struggling with memory. So the way that we went about and had a look at this is with another memory test. So this one is slightly different. So what happens here is same sort of format, in that people are asked to recall a list of words. So here it was owl, desk, racket, grapes. But instead of just giving the words, as we do on many other memory tests, what we did is we offered a category that was related to each of those words. And what that does is it helps to, it acts as a pointer, a cue to that word, and supports the way in which a person can learn that information. So rather than just owl and desk, we would say, well, there's a bird, and that is an owl. And then there's an item of furniture, and then that is a desk. So that was done when the person was learning, and then it was also done when it came to asking for those words back. Having the patient say, give us the words, but then also saying, well, if you can't quite remember it, there was a bird or there was a piece of furniture. So helping to draw attention back to the words, supporting that learning. And what we found is, so on your left here, you've got people without a diagnosis of PCA, again in the blue, and otherwise healthy, and then in green you've got our PCA research group. And you can see that when learning is supported in that way, they manage to learn exactly the same as that healthy group. Not an issue at all. Then when it came to asking for those words back, asking the groups to recall those words, we first asked them without any help, so without using those pointers and those cues. And what you now see is that group without the PCA diagnosis, otherwise healthy in the blue, they're able to still manage that, not bring all the words, but most of the words back. But our PCA group was starting to struggle. They were able to bring some words back, others they weren't able to recall. So then what we did was, we brought those pointers back, those cues. We helped to focus attention back to the words that were learnt. And what you now find is they're again exactly the same level as that healthy group. So the really critical kind of take-home point here is that it appears that attention seems to be the culprit in these memory symptoms that are being experienced by our PCA group. And the other critical point is that it seems to be the case that actually we can ameliorate that memory deficit by supporting and offering support in the way in which information is learnt and the way in which that information is retrieved as well. So what we're now doing in Oxford is that we're working with an occupational therapist in particular, but other researchers, to try to translate this into something useful in terms of support or intervention that could be used by people with PCA and their families to help to support memory at home and in everyday life. That's work that's only just begun, so I do hope that I'll be able to come back and share it with you in the near future. But that's the next step here. So just a second project that I thought that you might be interested in. We were interested in how activities of daily living change in PCA. So activities of daily living, they refer to everyday actions that we do to ourselves or in the home, and are important for our everyday functioning and the functioning of our homes, our families, general life. Some are quite basic, so things like eating, bathing, getting ourselves dressed, going to the bathroom, and then some are more complex, so things like organising medication, preparing meals from beginning to end, doing the housework. And so what we did was we asked our PCA research group and their families again, how many of these sorts of activities were people able to manage entirely independently. So the numbers here refer to the percentage of patients who are able to manage an activity just entirely alone, no support required. So if you take the first activity here, hygiene, you can see that more than 90%, so almost all of our group, are able to manage personal hygiene, bathing, shaving, brushing teeth, that sort of thing, almost entirely independently. But then you have things like dressing, where only about 70%, which is still a high percentage, managing that entirely alone. More support is needed. When it comes to more complicated activities, so right towards the end here, things like preparing a meal, only about 40% of our PCA research group was able to manage that entirely alone, most requiring some support in order to complete that task safely and effectively. So I guess it's intuitive that the more basic activities people are able to manage independently, but the more complicated activities, some support is needed. But this sort of information is incredibly useful in clinically. So this sort of thing we're using again with our occupational therapist colleagues, with our medical colleagues, to help to understand what are the sorts of things that people with PCA need, and their families indeed, need support with, and at what stage. And again, we're looking towards building interventions, support systems that would help to maintain independence for longer in PCA. Again, I hope that's something that I can come speak to you about at a later date. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So thank you so much, Samrah. I can't tell you what a privilege it is running these groups to have someone who not only has really invested a huge amount of their professional and personal energy in working with people with PCA, but also someone who understands the context of these groups, and that a nice short presentation and the opportunity for questions and interaction is exactly what we're after, rather than a long spiel. So that was a wonderful summary. Thank you so much. I can see lots of hands shut up already. Let's go from the front back. Thank you.
Hi, Samrah. That was really interesting, and thank you very much. Sheila, my wife, is 10 years into the process. What I'm interested to know, please, in relation to your fundamental points is your control group mixed? For example, are there different stages in the PCA journey? And secondly, have you done any comparison of the rate of decline over time?
So the two groups that we had, one what we refer to as a control group, they were people who have no diagnosis of PCA or any other condition. They otherwise are healthy. The PCA group was a mixture of people. So some people who we just met, so maybe complaining of symptoms for maybe a year or 2 years, and then I think the maximum was something like 7 or 8 years. So it was a complete range of people. And I've not shown you, we did split up that group to see how people who had experienced PCA for only a few years were managing, and how people who had it for longer were managing. And the reason, because actually there wasn't a huge amount of difference, essentially showing that our PCA group, who I think is representative of people with PCA, are able to manage independently or with support these sorts of everyday tasks. And then your second question was?
Sorry, the second question, sort of linked to the first one,
Yes.
is are you now starting to measure over time? Because it seems to me perfectly obvious,
Yes.
living with somebody who has PCA,
Yes.
that it gets worse over time.
Yes.
And so some of your conclusions could
Yes.
be challenged on the grounds that if
Yes.
you are not reasonably specific about the journey and the time in the journey,
Yes.
then an overall percentage isn't terribly meaningful for somebody who's had it for a short time versus somebody who's had it for a long time.
Indeed, yes. And again, so we did split that. I didn't show that. Perhaps I should have. But showing, I guess, what you would intuitively expect. So we split our group into very mild, having PCA for a couple of years, having a kind of a group that had a PCA, I think, for something like up to 4 or 5 years, and then much longer, so 6 years plus. And as you would expect, yes, things become progressively more difficult, and independence is lost on those activities as the years go on. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Next question, Susie.
Hi, thank you very much. It's very, very interesting. How large was your study group?
We had, in which one, the memory or the ADLs? Because there are two different. With the memory, we had about 20 people. And then with our ADL study, Siobhan can tell you because she actually conducted that study, about 30, I think it was, wasn't it? 29 or 30? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I found the supported learning concept very, very interesting. On the flip side of that, when my mother was in the early stages, she couldn't remember words, but she could describe them. I mean, the number of times she said to me, "Oh, we had lovely dinner last night. It was, like a chicken, but bigger." Yeah, so she knew what she wanted to say, but it was the actual word. She didn't need the prompting for it. She just, because she could describe it. So it's sort of like the flip side of that.
Yeah, and I guess that's related to language, which I think Seb can probably answer better.
I think it's that complexity that I referred to at the beginning, that one's never dealing with one problem, with one challenge, and so that's a great description. Clearly, most of us understand very clearly from what Myrtle said that was a turkey. That's my presumption anyway. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was something very fancy like a goose or something like that. But I think that's that mixed challenge. So that would be something which again, qualitatively, one would say that's a very PCA-ish thing, rather than a sort of typical Alzheimer-y thing. Someone with a predominant memory problem wouldn't really necessarily remember to recall the events that Myrtle was clearly referring to, whereas that's a very clear memory of a situation of being in that context of having that food, and it's purely the label that's escaped.
Can I ask one more question? Did you find with the memory loss with people, it was specific types of words that people were losing? I know Mummy seemed to lose her T words. So she'd say, at the end of my feet, toes. Yes. And any word beginning with a T tended to be the words that she lost first.
Oh, interesting. No, we didn't look at the type of words. It was a kind of just a random list of words. I don't know is that something that you looked into?
I think the only thing it chimes with for me is that when we did our only real study of language challenges for people with PCA a few years ago, it was very much that sort of sound-based aspect of language rather than the meaning components of language that proved challenging for people. So lots of people, one of our tasks I remember was asking people to describe their most recent holiday or kind of an interesting event, and it was the sort of verbal slips. So lots of people would, I remember one lady in particular saying, those sea bills. So, clearly one knew exactly that she knew the word she was referring to and the concept she was referring to, but it was the sounds that made up that word that were tricky. Another video we often use is of a former group member describing Brighton Pier, and there's a sort of a dome at the end of the pier, and she says, it's like what they're trying to elect for the Olympics, and clearly she meant erect. But so she was pointing at the right word, but the sounds within it changed. So maybe it's that those sound-based elements, maybe the T representations took a bit more of a hit than other sounds. Questions? Yes, please.
So we're quite new to this, but I just wondered, in terms of how, if your visual processing is affected, how much does your vision affect the formation of new memories? You know how people say, I'm quite a visual person. And if that processing is being compromised or interrupted, so I know for myself, I think I'm a very visual person, so I remember pictures. And that's how I think that is a sort of fundament to my formation of my memories. It's just the strongest muscle. I just wondered whether that had been something you looked at, or was that...
Yes, it was actually. So this idea of visual imagery being important to the formation of new memories, but also recalling past memories as well. So we looked at both of those things, and what we essentially found in summary was that actually your visual imagery is more important for what has gone. So we found that our PCA research group was struggling to bring back not a full memory, but the details of a memory that had gone by, so your autobiographical memory. So for example, we would ask people, maybe about the first, do they remember the first day at school? Yes, they do. They can give the date, they can almost give an address and so on, but describing the school or the school gate or the first teacher was difficult, so the loss of that visual image. So then we looked at whether that would also affect the formation of new memories, and actually we didn't find a direct association with the word lists that we were using, but as I say, they're just a list of random words, and perhaps it was the sample wasn't big enough, the test wasn't appropriate. So it's something that we're looking into in a little bit more detail. But I think it's a very, very interesting question.
I think it's also it's a really good point in relation to things like clinical trials. So often people with PCA are rightly given the opportunity to take part in drug trials, but sometimes the tests which have been chosen to see whether the drug is being effective or not aren't very suitable for people with PCA. So there are lots of memory tests out there, as Samrah's referred to, which are like a shopping list, or a number of very visual, concrete things. And actually, if you have an imagery problem, then it's harder to use the strategies that most of us would use to encode them.
Yes, yes, yeah.
The category is very important, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Hi. I'm first time a newbie, so some of the questions, or one of the questions may be a bit naive. Please bear with me. The Addenbrooke's cognitive examination you refer to as ACE-R. Is that the same as ACE-3, or is that a different?
It's just an iteration. So ACE-R refers to the Addenbrooke's cognitive examination revised. So it was kind of it was number 2, and then ACE-3 is number 3. And all that's happened is that we found that certain tests were a little bit redundant within the ACE, and so we updated it slightly. But they can be used, and they are used interchangeably.
Okay.
Yes.
And one more quick one. The memory problems. What were the timelines between long-term, medium, and short-term? I'm not sure if you mentioned that. So.
Oh, so that was actually, we didn't look at that in terms of our memory group. In our memory group, so the people who were asked to complete these memory tests, they were all within 2 to 3 years of having met us in clinic. So what we classed as very early on. We tend to see people in our clinic in Oxford when they notice themselves these very early visual changes. And often they'll say, well, I've only noticed these sorts of things for 6 months to a year. So everybody was therefore only within about 3 years of noticing these first changes. So I guess that's what makes this memory or attention problem interesting, is that it seems to be troubling quite early on.
Yeah, I was also asking about the distinguishing between longer-term memory and more short-term. Yeah.
Okay. So yes, so this all refers to what you would refer to as long-term memory. Yes, we didn't look at short-term.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I'm afraid we only have time for one more question, and I realise I've been terribly frontist. I've been taking all the questions from down here, and there's one right at the back. So would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Just a couple of points I've noticed with my husband and words. He has his own words for things. For example, the garage is now the cellar. His mobile phone is his light. And I don't know whether I should correct him every time because I don't want to frustrate him. But I know what he means now. And it's frustrating for me at first when he starts using these different words for certain things. But once I've sort of sorted them out, then we can have a conversation. I know what he's talking about. That's number one. The second point was with the personal hygiene. He knows perfectly well what he's got to do, but I find it's the movement that is, and the tiredness. He gets, he's fatigued. So even showering is very tiring for him. And we've now introduced a stool in the shower, but because that's something different that he's never had to use before, that is also becoming a problem.
Yes.
So it's just those points, and I did wonder whether I should correct him about his words, or do I just let him go on using the words he wants to use?
I think you're probably better placed to answer that.
There's a wonderful lady called Anna Volkmar who's about to join the Rare Dementia support team. She's a fantastic speech and language therapist, and her interest is particularly not just in the words and getting people the sort of traditional view of speech and language therapy, but more about communication and communication partner training. And I think what she'd say, I hope I'm not misquoting her or misrepresenting her, would be the purpose of language is to get someone else to know what you're referring to. So if you know that when he says light, he means phone, that's great. Why correct? Why, if the message has got across, I think that's absolutely fine. And I think one does have to be increasingly flexible and adaptive about how one communicates and picking up on those signals, be they verbal or non-verbal, that help you to know what someone wants, what their state is, what their desires are, because that's really fundamentally what all of us try and do. And if it's in the slightly different words to that in which it used to be, I think there are worse things. Okay. I'm going to pause us there. Samrah, thank you so much. I know you can stay for a few minutes at lunchtime, so if anybody would like to grab Samrah afterwards for a few more questions, then that would be great. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time. Great. Now, before lunch, I'm just inviting Simon Rosser and I to come up and join me. I'm going to borrow the other microphone, and we're going to tag team a little bit. I thought if we perched delicately, what with us both being such svelte figures, over here, then we could... Oh, perfect. That works, that works. Then I thought we would try and make this as informal as we can. But Simon very generously offered to come and speak with us today. Simon is a very long-standing member of the group, with his wife Mariola, who sadly passed away in March. A couple of months ago, Simon got in contact offering to come and share some of the experiences which he and Mariola had of being part of the group, and the support they had found within it, and also some of the highs and lows, some of the challenges and opportunities that had come through living with PCA for many years. So, Simon, thank you so much. I've got a microphone here for you. And I suppose... It works. Yeah. Great. If you're okay to, I thought it would be great for people to hear a little bit about you and Mariola and some of the support that you found or sought through your journey with PCA.
Okay, well, you gave me some questions which I'm going to answer. I'm still fairly emotional about things, so it's easier for me to sort of follow a text than just extemporize, so forgive me for that. I'm going to follow the questions that Seb suggested he'd ask. The first one was where we both drew support from over the course of the journey with PCA. The answer I would give is, I think first and foremost, we gave and received support from the family, meaning Mariola, myself, and our children, Christopher and Chloe. I would describe us as a close family, and we both gave and received support from each other. Chloe was very young at the time, or relatively young. She was 15 when Mariola was diagnosed. Both children were very upset at the diagnosis, and it affected both of them quite deeply. I think it's probably a truism to say that if you give love, you get it back in spades, and that's what we experienced with the children. That, I think, sustained us more than anything throughout. I think the support group was also very helpful. Rare dementia is, of course, rare. Seb may remember when Mariola first agreed to participate in research, her asking you if she was the only one who had this disease. That reflected her feeling of being alone in suffering from this disease. Your response was she should come to the support group, which she attended pretty well for the rest of her life. This meant she no longer felt so alone, and she appreciated the company of people who had the disease and other carers. I also know that you're aware that I think participation in research was also very helpful. It meant that she felt at a time when she could understand that she was losing mental capacity, you might say losing her mental powers, she felt she was able, nevertheless, to do something useful and to contribute to something that would improve the chances of treating the disease. Moreover, the research necessarily involved focusing on the participant, and it was conducted sensitively. That focus was, I think, therapeutic and made her feel cared for and supported. Also, although there is little treatment for this condition at the moment, I think visits to the National Hospital every 6 months or so were helpful. It made Mariola feel somebody cared, and whilst really the visits were only a matter of monitoring the progression of the disease, the fact that she came to the hospital was a form of caring for and supporting her. Later on, we had a wonderful carer called Lynn, and Mariola and Lynn were like a couple of friends or sisters rather than a carer and patient. That was enormously helpful throughout. I think another question was, where did Mariola continue to find value or meaning in all this? I think, put quite simply, Mariola continued to live her life. We continued throughout, as far as possible, with our normal lives. Of course, what we could do became more and more limited all the time. In the first few years, we could go on holiday as a family, and I remember we went to Grenada, Santorini, and various parts of Greece. For a while, she took up cycling again, which she hadn't done much of for years, and for a couple of years, we would typically take folding bikes out into the country and cycle. Eventually, she fell off and broke her elbow, which fortunately fairly miraculously healed, so we didn't cycle anymore, but we did a lot of walking instead. As recently as last October, we had a 2-mile walk around Hampstead Heath. We did things we'd always done with the children. In November, we had fireworks, as we always had done from them being born, in the garden with children and friends, and had baked potatoes, sausages, and mulled wine afterwards. At Christmas, we celebrated, as we always did, Polish Christmas on Christmas Eve and English Christmas on Christmas Day, so we always had two. She had her fair share of vodka on Christmas Eve and and turkey on Christmas Day. We did things less with friends, but we did do some things. In September, we went to a friend of hers' birthday party, to which we'd been going for some 30 years, and she enjoyed seeing people whom she'd known all that time. Over the Christmas period, we went into a neighbour's for Christmas drinks. With the support of family and Lynn, the carer, and continuing life in the normal way, Mariola was almost invariably smiling or laughing. And, apparently happier than the average person. The simplest things in life seem to give her pleasure. For some reason, she always seemed to like to go to the council dump, perhaps to take some garden waste or rubbish. When I did weekend shopping round supermarkets, she always wanted to come with me. So I think she found value and meaning in just continuing to live her life and enjoying having her family around her. While latterly she couldn't really do anything for herself, such as drink a glass of water, get up out of a chair, or speak, she did not lose her memory. And it's clear that she understood what was going on, what we were saying to her, and she certainly knew all of us, and indeed friends who she'd known and sometimes not seen for years. Her sweet personality never left her. We were very glad she stayed at home to the end. Seb asked what the toughest challenge we faced. I suppose the answer is there are continual challenges. We've all had to cope with the initial diagnosis, which probably came as a shock to all of us. There are, of course, different stages which present you with shocks and challenges, such as when you have to make the decision to invite a carer into your life, which obviously makes a major change in family life. We were just fortunate in finding the perfect carer who just blended into our life like another member of the family. Things, of course, go wrong. Once she gave me the slip, and got out of the house and went for a 27-hour walk, lightly dressed in December snow. Having spent the night out, presumably walking, she was eventually found collapsed miles away at 7 o'clock the following evening and taken to hospital. The police were very good and called all the hospitals in the southeast periodically and eventually found her. Over the last few years, she developed seizures or epileptic fits. They are, of course, always shocking and frightening, and she fell over and bashed her head on more than one occasion. I think, however, what came along, we just coped with it, and we did our best to carry on as normal. Seb asked, were there any major milestones that we'd like to reflect on? I suppose you could say the most important thing, or milestone, was in the early days when we decided to just carry on as normal as far as possible. Having made that decision, that is what we did, and we didn't dwell on the illness and what was happening to her. Just very occasionally, Mariola would get upset and perhaps be tearful, but that might be once a year, and a kiss and a cuddle would end it in a matter of minutes. Seb asked what advice I'd give to others who are now going through the journey. I suppose I would say that if you can, do as we did. Carry on as far as possible with life as normal. There is no point in allowing yourself to dwell on what is happening. Otherwise, I'm sure it would be very easy to get depressed. Life is to be lived. Try and live it as best you can. You have to continually adapt, and of course, as time goes on, what you can do becomes more limited. Nevertheless, you can still do things and enjoy life. I think for me, there was another thing that was important, which was that I continued to work full time. I could do this because I had an excellent carer during the week, daytime. I knew with Lynn, Mariola would be well cared for and happy. This meant that although I was carer at other times of the day and at weekends, I was not overburdened with being a full-time carer. I also used to go out by myself or with friends or with Christopher or Chloe. By continuing to do these things, I remained fresh and cheerful when I was with Mariola, and I never felt down, which was much better for me, and it was also much better for Mariola. I was also determined that our children would not, so far as possible, be burdened with caring responsibilities themselves. This meant they were always pleased to come and see us and to see Mariola. They said, and I believe them, that they wanted to come and see us, and they enjoyed coming to see us. And I never once said I thought they ought to come and see us. Rather, they were the ones asking if they could come and see us. So, finally, I would just say that although, of course, we wouldn't have wished Mariola to be ill, and of course, life was dramatically changed by the disease, we did feel that we and she enjoyed quality of life, and I really wouldn't have wished to have missed that time that I had with her. When she was ill, right up to the end for the world. And we miss her enormously now. She has gone. I think it's probably apparent. Okay, right.
Simon, thank you.
Sorry.
Simon, thank you so much for sharing that, because I think apart from the extraordinary commendation which I think is deserved to you as people, as a couple, as a family, for living with this in the way that you did, I'm obviously deeply indebted to you for coming and speaking today, because it's so easy to want to, or to allow oneself to buy into the fear of the future. And certainly we have many people who are here with us today for the first time, and we're very aware that asking someone who's now sadly lost their partner to PCA to come and speak may seem a very stark opening to your experience of being with us at the support group. And of course, we recognise that there are times and places for providing certain types of support, for asking certain types of questions. But the reason why I think Simon and Mariola and many of the other people here offer such an extraordinary perspective on this situation that you all find yourselves in is that living with it and living with it together, there's huge, if you like, institutional knowledge, huge understanding that no professional, no matter what their training or stripe, can offer. And also the most common question we have for people who are considering coming to a group like this for the first time is, I'm worried about what I might see. I'm worried about who I might meet. I'm worried about seeing my own future. And for me personally, hearing your testimony, hearing how you conducted yourselves, how your perspective on all this is deeply encouraging. Because there are so many stories out there, so many prejudices, so many stereotypes that about what life will be like once you have one of these labels. And we don't want to cloister away those of you who've now passed out the other side of your journey with PCA. We want you to continue to be part of this group, to share of your experiences, and to demystify what next might look like. So, as with everything we always say at these groups, if there are things that have been troubling for you or difficult for you, you're not obliged to take them away with you. Take what's useful. But certainly I, for one, am deeply grateful to you, Simon, for sharing something of your and Mariola's story, and for enabling us to look at life with PCA. Thank you.
If anyone does want to ask any questions, I'm happy to take them if that's any help.
Thank you. I'm sure that would be great. If anyone, questions or reflections or shared concerns or just comments, I'll bring my microphone around.
Thank you, Simon, for something which was incredibly moving, and where I think we are beginning to share some of the experiences that you just related. I do have two questions. If they're too painful to answer, I would understand. The first one is, would you be able to tell us how long it took from the first time Mariola understood that something was not quite right, or you did on her behalf, to the time that she left you?
About 14 years. Diagnosis was, I think, 12 years, but clearly something wasn't right to begin with. She used to teach A-level maths, and I think Chloe came to me one day and said, "Can you help me with this maths, Dad?" And I sort of said, "Me? You're joking." Ask Mum, and she said, "Oh, she's so slow. She must have forgotten or something." Now, for somebody who would teach maths and had done a maths degree, that was extraordinary. And I think we were slow to pick it up, and we just thought, oh, well, she hasn't been teaching for years, maybe she has forgotten. And then she came and then did some figures. She used to get her figures ready for me to help her with a tax return. And she spent a month getting the figures together, and they were all wrong. And again, amazingly, I didn't think there's something really wrong here, because she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. It seemed so hard this time to do it." Well, I think most of us find doing a tax return hard, so you didn't really think there's a problem. Then she began to lose the ability to write, and that was really the trigger for getting her to hospital and getting tests. So she began to write like a 5-year-old, and then she gradually lost that ability. Then we went to the doctor, to hospital, and eventually here, and then it was diagnosed.
Thank you. So much of that rings very strong bells, and we're experiencing some of what you've just related. And the second question, maybe more difficult and rather personal, is what was the cause of death as related on the death certificate?
I'm not quite... She died of pneumonia. She'd had a fall and bashed her head 2 weeks before, and we'd been into hospital to get tests done, and each time it was ages in A&E, and then no, there's no change. She seemed to recover after it. a couple of days feeling tired and so on, but she seemed to recover. And we did the usual going around the supermarkets at the weekend, and Lynn took her walking half a mile or so locally, so we thought things were all right. Then on the Sunday she had, I gave her one of her favourite foods, and she seemed to be having bits of it coming out of her mouth. Normally she'd wolf it down, because it was something she'd really liked. And she in fact ate a lot. But maybe the swallowing reflex was going, and maybe what happened is she took something into the lung, and we were not aware, and then she got an infection. And in fact, on the Friday, we called an ambulance, and the ambulance people tested her breathing, said, well, there might be something there, but I don't think there really is, but I'll tell the hospital. And when we got to hospital, the x-ray showed that her lungs were seriously affected. She wasn't very good with antibiotics, and she just didn't respond to antibiotic treatment at all. This was Friday lunchtime we got there, and she died on Saturday lunchtime.
Thank you so much. You were an incredibly brave person, and that was very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. That was incredibly emotional, especially sitting here. I'm 24, and I sometimes wonder whether life experience makes it a little easier. I think my question is probably better aimed at you. I know you mentioned your wife had seizures. Is that something classical with PCA, or is it something that can come from other things? I'm not really.
So seizures are a common consequence of many different types of neurological damage. So for example, lots of people who've had a stroke can then experience seizures with scar tissue. It is something which we recognise in a number of different degenerative conditions as the disease progresses. They can take different forms, and of course one always has to make sure that they're investigated in the unlikely event that it's some additional neurological syndrome. But yeah, they can happen as time progresses, but equally they can often be well managed, and particularly when people recognise that they might be a part of something that they're going to face in the coming years. Yeah. John Schott, who'll be here running the small group about medication and other kind of neurological queries, will also be able to comment on that if you'd like to ask him in one of the small groups later on. Would anybody, before we break for lunch, would anybody else like to make any other reflections? Yeah.
Again, I'd like to thank you very much for that. I was very moved because my wife and I have gone through the same journey. There were some differences I just wanted to highlight. First of all, she was diagnosed in about the end of 2013, just with Alzheimer's. It obviously had been going on for a few years before. And she is now at the stage, not that many years later, when she's almost completely helpless. We had to transfer her into a nursing home. Just prior to this, she didn't have seizures. She just collapsed. You know, her eyes closed and she went straight down on the floor. This is a part of the Alzheimer's, which was a great surprise to us. And it's to do with being very nervous and agitated, I believe. She's now at a stage, and we had your same experience. We kept her at home for as long as we could. We had a carer, a very good carer, the same experience as you, but it got to the point where we could neither have we could neither control her with carer, with all of us, our sons, myself. It just got out of hand, and she did escape twice. We did have to invoke the police. I mean, when you look back on it, it's quite funny, but it was terribly worrying. So these things happen. Now she's at a stage where she has to have more or less everything done for her. Feeding, because she can't see. She literally can't see. She's just wandering around, walking into walls and things like that. And also, very strangely, finally, I'd like to say, since all this began happening, she can't stay still. So she's continually walking, and she's continually walking on the spot if she can't move. And she has to get up during meals and walk. And the carers at the home have to spend time walking around the corridors with her because she won't stand still. But I would just like to finally say our journey was very similar to yours, but in the end, we had to transfer her into a home. And I'd like to thank you again to feel that we're not alone in all that we've been through as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing. So we'll break for lunch now. I think, as I said earlier, please take from this what's right for you. I think one of the encouragements of these very moving and for some very difficult sessions is perhaps even only just a slight widening of the sense of possibilities. So many people are given labels, and society and other people, your friends and family, sometimes may only be able to see one ending, one path, which might be very dark, which we know we're battling against many stereotypes and ideas around what living with a condition like PCA might be like. I would say what you so rarely hear in the media is you never see an image like this. You never hear of someone 14 years after their problems emerged enjoying Christmas with their families and downing vodka. And I'm not saying that will be everyone's story. Of course, these conditions, our brains are all different, the conditions, the way they affect us are all different. We're different people to start with. Of course, there will be different routes for different people. For some faster, for some slower, for some a very specific visual condition that remains purely visual for many years to come, for others something that spreads and affects other skills and abilities. But even knowing the possibilities, I think, and that widening of the landscape of what the future might look like, I hope, at least for some, will be encouraging. So, Simon, thank you. So indebted to you for coming, and only to commend your bravery and openness in sharing all you have today. Thank you so much.